The discovery. There are worse places to encounter something that will change your life forever than a bus stop in the pouring rain. At least, that's what Martin Reeves told himself as he huddled beneath the flimsy shelter, watching water cascade from the rusted metal roof in sheets. The digital display blinked delayed with the smug confidence of public transportation that knew you had nowhere else to go. Martin pulled his worn jacket tighter, the patches on the elbows barely holding together. 6 years of veterinary technician training, 4 years working at the clinic, and all he had to show for it was an eviction notice waiting at his apartment and the smell of antiseptic that never quite washed out of his clothes. The rain intensified, driving the few other would-be passengers to seek shelter elsewhere. Martin stayed put, partly because his apartment was depressing, and partly because he'd spent his last bit of change on a coffee that was now growing cold in his hands. That's when he saw it, a small cardboard box sliding slowly across the sidewalk, pushed by the growing rivulets of rainwater. Another piece of trash in a city that never seemed to run short of it. Except this box was moving against the current. What the hell? Martin muttered, setting down his coffee and stepping into the downpour. The box stopped moving when he approached, as if it knew it had been spotted. Kneeling down, Martin gently lifted one soggy corner. A pair of luminous eyes, iridescent like opals with swirling galaxies inside them, stared back at him. The creature was no larger than a kitten, with scales that shimmered between deep purple and electric blue depending on how the dim streetlight hit them. Small, nub-like protrusions extended from its back. Wings, perhaps, though they looked too underdeveloped to be functional. "Hey there, little guy," Martin said softly, using the same tone he reserved for the most frightened animals at the clinic. "What are you doing out here?" The creature made a sound somewhere between a chirp and a purr, then sneezed. A small puff of blue flame escaped its nostrils, evaporating the raindrops directly in front of it. That's when Martin noticed the note, tucked into the side of the box, partially protected from the rain by the creature's body. He carefully extracted it, trying not to disturb his discovery. Written in an elegant script that seemed to shimmer slightly on the page, it read, "Guardian needed for last ember dragonet. Danger follows. Keep warm. Feed meat. Do not expose to direct sunlight until first molting. If found by the Vex, all is lost. They must not have this one." Martin read the note twice, then looked back at the creature, the dragonet, which was now attempting to climb out of the box, its tiny claws scrabbling against the wet cardboard. "This has to be a prank," he said to himself, even as the rational part of his brain catalogued the creature's features. Reptilian but warm-blooded judging by the heat radiating from its body, respiratory system capable of producing combustion, scales unlike any terrestrial species he'd ever studied. The dragonet chirped again, more insistently this time, and Martin made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He scooped up the box with the creature inside and tucked it under his jacket. "Okay, little one, let's get you somewhere dry," he said, abandoning his place at the bus stop and his cooling coffee. The rain seemed to intensify as he walked, as if trying to wash away any evidence of their meeting. Martin's apartment was a one-bedroom affair on the 6th floor of a building with an elevator that worked approximately half the time. Today was not one of those times. By the time he reached his door, the dragonet had squirmed its way out of the box and was now curled around Martin's neck like a scaly scarf, its body temperature keeping both of them surprisingly warm. "Home sweet home," Martin said sarcastically as he opened the door to reveal a space that was clean but sparse, the furniture secondhand, the walls bare except for his veterinary certification and a few faded posters from his college days. The dragonet leaped from his shoulder as soon as they were inside, landing gracefully on the coffee table and immediately beginning to explore, its tail leaving a slight scorch mark on the wood surface. "Hey, careful there," Martin said, reaching for the creature and then hesitating. What exactly was he supposed to do with a baby dragon? The note had said meat and warmth, so he started there, turning up the heat and heading to his refrigerator. The pickings were slim, a half-eaten sandwich, some questionable milk, and a package of ground beef he'd been saving for his one decent meal of the week. The dragonette made the decision for him, somehow sensing the meat despite the closed refrigerator door. It let out an excited trill and bounded across the apartment, leaving tiny scorch marks on the carpet. "That's coming out of my security deposit," Martin sighed, unwrapping the beef and placing it on a plate. The dragonette approached cautiously, sniffed at the meat, then devoured it with surprising efficiency, its tiny teeth sharper than they looked. While it ate, Martin examined the note again. Ember dragonette. Vex. Danger. It all sounded like something from one of the fantasy novels that had gotten him through the lonely nights of his childhood, except the creature currently licking its chops on his coffee table was undeniably real. Martin's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his boss at the clinic. "Need you to come in early tomorrow." Jenkins called out sick again. He texted back a confirmation, then looked at the dragonette, which had curled into a ball, and was now watching him with those otherworldly eyes. What was he supposed to do with it while he was at work? "I can't exactly take you to the clinic," he told it. "Pretty sure Dr. Michaels would have a heart attack if she saw you." The dragonette blinked slowly, then yawned, revealing a mouth full of needle-like teeth and a forked tongue that seemed to flicker with tiny sparks. "I guess I could set you up in the bathroom. It's warm, and there's water, and—" A sharp knock at the door cut him off. The dragonette immediately went rigid, its scales darkening to a deep midnight blue. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mr. Reeves, building management. Need to talk to you about your rent situation." The voice was flat, almost mechanical. Martin frowned. It was nearly 11 p.m., far too late for the building manager to be making rounds, especially in this weather. And how did they know he was back? He hadn't passed anyone on his way in. "Just a minute," he called, quickly scooping up the dragonette and carrying it to the bathroom. He set it gently in the bathtub and whispered, "Stay quiet, okay?" The dragonette curled into a tight ball, its scales now almost black, seeming to understand the need for secrecy. Martin closed the bathroom door and approached his apartment entrance, checking the peephole. A man in a dark uniform stood outside, his face obscured by a cap pulled low. Something about his posture seemed wrong, too stiff, too precise. "Can I see some ID?" Martin called through the door. There was a pause, then the man reached into his pocket and held up a badge. It looked official enough, but Martin couldn't make out the details through the peephole's distortion. "I'd like to discuss this in the morning, if that's all right," Martin said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's late, and I have an early shift tomorrow." Another pause, longer this time. Then, in the same flat tone, "We detected an unauthorized life form in this building. Regulations require immediate inspection." A chill ran down Martin's spine. Unauthorized life form. Not a pet or an animal. A life form. And we, not I. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "I don't know what you're talking about," Martin replied, his eyes darting to the bathroom door. "I don't have any pets. Building policy, right?" "Open the door, Mr. Reeves." The flatness had left the voice, replaced by a cold authority that seemed to seep through the wood like frost. "Non-compliance will be noted." Martin backed away from the door. His apartment was 6 stories up, with no fire escape outside his window. The only way out was through that door or a very long drop. A soft scratching sound came from behind him. The dragonette had managed to open the bathroom door and was now scuttling across the floor towards him, its eyes wide with what looked unmistakably like fear. "We know you have it, Mr. Reeves," the voice continued. "The Ember dragonette belongs to us. Its retrieval is non-negotiable." The dragonette reached Martin and climbed up his leg, claws digging into his jeans until it reached his chest. It pressed itself against him, trembling. Martin could feel its rapid heartbeat, almost in sync with his own. "Listen," Martin called, trying to buy time while his mind raced for options. I don't know what you're talking about, but I have rights. You can't just. A sharp click interrupted him, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. They were picking the lock. Martin looked around frantically. The dragonette chirped softly, then nudged his chin with its head, gesturing towards the window with surprising intelligence. "Are you crazy?" Martin whispered. "That's 6 floors down." The lock clicked again, more definitively this time. The door handle began to turn. The dragonette chirped more urgently, then leaped from Martin's chest to the windowsill. It pressed its forehead against the glass, which began to glow faintly where they touched. A thin line appeared in the glass, not a crack, but more like a seam that hadn't been there before. Martin didn't have time to question it. The door was opening. He lunged for the window, grabbing the dragonette with one hand while pushing against the glass with the other. To his astonishment, the window swung outward like a door, revealing not the expected drop to the street below, but a swirling vortex of light that hovered in the air just outside. Behind him, the apartment door swung open. Martin caught a glimpse of the building manager, a figure that looked human at first glance, but moved with a fluid grace that no human joints could manage. Its eyes reflected the light like mirrors. "Stop," it commanded, its voice now a metallic shriek. Martin didn't hesitate. Clutching the dragonette to his chest, he jumped through the window into the swirling light. The last thing he heard was the creature's rage, a sound like tearing metal that followed him as he fell into the unknown, the dragonette's warmth the only certainty in a world suddenly turned upside down. The Alliance. Falling through a portal feels exactly like you'd expect, terrifying, disorienting, and strangely like being turned inside out, while simultaneously being compressed into a space far too small for your body. At least, that's how Martin would later describe it. The journey lasted both an eternity and an instant. Then, with jarring suddenness, Martin slammed into solid ground. The dragonette still clutched protectively against his chest. "Oh God," he groaned, rolling onto his back. The sky above him was wrong, too purple, with 2 suns hanging low on the horizon. "Where are we?" The dragonette chirped, seemingly unaffected by their dimensional leap, and squirmed out of his grasp. It bounded a few feet away, then turned back to look at him expectantly. Martin sat up slowly, cataloging his body for injuries. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed broken. Small victories. He looked around, taking in his surroundings for the first time. They had landed in what appeared to be a vast junkyard, but the junk consisted of technology unlike anything Martin had ever seen. Spacecraft parts, strange machinery, and devices that defied categorization stretched as far as he could see, all of it covered in a fine purple dust. "I'm definitely not in Kansas anymore," Martin muttered, climbing to his feet. The dragonette chirped again, more insistently this time. All right, I'm coming," Martin said, following the creature as it scampered between piles of debris. "But just so you know, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing here." The dragonette led him through the maze of alien technology with purpose, occasionally stopping to ensure Martin was still following. After about 15 minutes of walking, they reached what appeared to be a clearing in the junk. At its center sat a domed structure that might once have been part of a spacecraft. It had been converted into a makeshift shelter, with a door fashioned from salvaged metal. The dragonette chirped excitedly and bounded toward the structure. Before it reached the door, however, the entrance swung open, and a figure stepped out. Martin froze. The figure was humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, but clearly not human. Its skin was a mottled green-gray, with patterns that shifted subtly like oil on water. It wore what appeared to be a patchwork of salvaged technology as armor. Well, the alien said in perfect English, though its mouth didn't move in sync with the words. "Dracket brings a human. How unusual." The dragonette, Dracket, apparently, chirped happily and leaped into the alien's arms, nuzzling against its chest. Martin said eloquently, his mind struggling to process this new development. "Hi." The alien made a sound that might have been laughter. Indeed. Greetings, human. I am Vex Treliacor, though you may call me Vex, as most find my full name challenging. The voice seemed feminine, though Martin realized he was making assumptions about alien gender, set Dracket down gently. And you are? Martin. Martin Reeves. He hesitated, then added, veterinary technician. From Earth. Obviously. Obviously. Vex agreed, amusement evident in her tone. Please, come inside before the sensors detect your biosignature. The collectors are quite active in this sector. Martin glanced back the way they had come, then at the alien offering him shelter. His choices seemed limited. Collectors. Would they happen to include someone who can pass for a human building manager but moves all wrong? Vex's expression shifted, the patterns on her skin darkening. You've encountered a seeker. You're fortunate to be alive. She gestured inside. Come. We have much to discuss. The interior of Vex's shelter was surprisingly cozy, filled with salvaged furniture and illuminated by globes of soft light that floated near the ceiling. Dracket immediately made himself at home, curling up on what appeared to be a cushion made specifically for him. Sit, Vex said, indicating a chair that looked almost, but not quite, like a human recliner. You must have questions. Martin lowered himself cautiously onto the chair, which adjusted to his body in a way that was both unsettling and extremely comfortable. Just a few, he said dryly. Starting with, what exactly does Dracket? Why were those things after him? And where the hell are we? Vex settled across from him, her movements fluid but with an underlying mechanical precision that reminded Martin she was not human, despite her superficially humanoid appearance. Dracket is an ember dragonet, the last of his kind, she began, her voice taking on a reverent quality. His species evolved on a world at the crossroads of multiple dimensional planes. They are natural conduits of interdimensional energy, which is why he was able to create a portal from your apartment. Martin glanced at Dracket, who was now happily gnawing on what looked like a piece of metal. The note said something about the Vex. I'm guessing that's not referring to you. Vex's skin rippled. The collectors call themselves the Vex Imperium. I was once one of them, hence my name. I defected when I learned their true intentions for the Ember Dragons, which are. The collectors seek to harvest Dracket's kind for their dimensional energy. They would use it to power weapons capable of tearing holes between realities, weapons they intend to use to conquer not just one universe, but all possible universes. Martin blinked, trying to absorb the scope of what Vex was saying. And they think I have him because. Because you do, Vex said simply. You were chosen. Chosen? By who? I found him at a bus stop in a cardboard box. Vex made that not quite laughing sound again. By Dracket, of course. The note was merely to provide basic care instructions. Ember Dragonets choose their guardians. They can sense those with compatible energy signatures. It's a survival mechanism, evolved over millennia. Martin looked at Dracket with new eyes. The Dragonet looked back, those opal eyes seeming to contain universes. So I was cosmically destined to find him at that specific bus stop. More likely, he sensed your approach and made sure to be found by you rather than someone else. Vex leaned forward. The question is not how you found each other, but what you intend to do now that you have. Martin ran a hand through his hair. I'm not sure I'm following. I'm a vet tech from Earth with an eviction notice and about $20 to my name. What exactly am I supposed to do against an interdimensional empire? You are supposed to do what humans always do, Vex said, her tone suggesting this should be obvious. The impossible. Before Martin could respond, an alarm blared, harsh and insistent. Vex leaped to her feet, her movements suddenly all efficiency. They've found us, she said, rushing to a console on a far wall. Faster than I anticipated. We need to move. Dracket was already at Martin's feet, chirping urgently. Martin picked him up, feeling the Dragonet's heart racing against his palm. Move where? Martin asked, following Vex as she grabbed what appeared to be weapons from a concealed compartment. I don't even know where we are now. We're in the Scraplands, a dimensional pocket between realities where discarded technology accumulates, Vex explained, thrusting what looked like a high-tech pistol into Martin's free hand. Point and think. It responds to neural impulses. Martin nearly dropped the weapon. I've never fired a gun in my life. Then today will be educational, Vex replied grimly, checking a display on her wrist. The Seekers are approaching from the north. We need to reach the gateway before they cut us off. The gateway. A permanent portal, one of the few stable dimensional anchors in this realm. If we can reach it, we can escape to somewhere the collectors will have difficulty following. Martin adjusted his grip on Dracket, who was now watching the ceiling intently. And if we can't? Vex's skin patterns shifted to a deep, ominous red. Then the collectors will have the last Ember Dragonet, and all realities will face subjugation. No pressure, Martin muttered, following Vex as she headed for a back exit. They moved through the junkyard at a pace that left Martin gasping for breath, Vex leading the way with preternatural agility. Dracket rode on Martin's shoulder, occasionally chirping directions that Vex seemed to understand. How much farther? Martin wheezed after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes of running. The gateway is just beyond that ridge, Vex said, pointing to a mountain of scrap ahead. But we're not alone. As if on cue, a beam of energy sizzled past Martin's ear, striking a piece of machinery behind him and causing it to explode into fragments. He ducked instinctively, nearly dislodging Dracket from his perch. Down, Vex commanded, pulling Martin behind a fallen spacecraft wing. The Seekers have found us. Martin peered cautiously around their cover. 3 figures were advancing through the junkyard, moving with that same unsettling fluidity he'd seen in his apartment. They wore sleek, metallic armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and each carried a weapon that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Those are Seekers, Martin whispered. Vex nodded grimly. Cybernetically enhanced hunters. They track, they find, they acquire. They do not negotiate, and they do not show mercy. Dracket growled, a sound surprisingly deep for his small size. His scales began to glow brighter, and Martin felt heat radiating from the Dragonet's body. He's preparing to fight, Vex said, her tone worried. But he's too young, too undeveloped. Using that much energy could harm him. Martin looked from Dracket to the advancing Seekers, then down at the weapon in his hand. A plan, reckless, possibly suicidal, but a plan nonetheless, began to form in his mind. The gateway, he said, keeping his voice low. How does it work? Can anyone use it? It responds to dimensional energy, Vex explained. An Ember Dragon can activate it naturally, or it can be activated using a force key. She tapped a device at her belt. And those Seekers, can they track Dracket specifically, or just unusual energy signatures? Vex's eyes narrowed, the patterns on her skin shifting, as she caught on to his thinking. They track energy. Dracket's signature is particularly distinctive, but any significant dimensional disturbance would draw their attention. Martin nodded, his decision made. Okay, here's what we're going to do. You take Dracket and make for the gateway. I'll create a distraction. What kind of distraction could a human possibly? Martin didn't let her finish. He grabbed the device from Vex's belt, the force key, and before she could stop him, slammed his hand down on what he hoped was the activation button. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Energy surged through Martin's body, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It felt like being struck by lightning, while simultaneously touching a live wire, every cell in his body vibrating at a frequency that threatened to tear him apart. Martin, Vex shouted, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. The force key glowed in Martin's hand, responding to something within him, something that by all rights shouldn't be there. Vex's eyes widened in shock. Impossible, she breathed. You're resonating with the key, but only those with interdimensional. No time. Martin gasped through gritted teeth. Take Dracket. Go. Now. To underscore his point, he stepped out from behind their cover, the force key held high above his head. It pulsed with energy, sending waves of dimensional distortion rippling through the air. The effect on the Seekers was immediate. All three turned toward him, their weapons raising in unison. Hey! Martin shouted, backing away from Vex and Dracket, drawing the Seekers' attention. Looking for something unusual? Well, come and get it. He turned and ran, not toward the gateway, but in the opposite direction, deeper into the junkyard. The Seekers followed, just as he'd hoped, their movements eerily synchronized as they pursued what they believed to be their target. Martin ducked and weaved through the debris, using his smaller size to navigate spaces the Seekers couldn't fit through. The force key continued to pulse in his hand, growing hotter by the second. He didn't know how long he could hold it, or what it was doing to him, but as long as it kept the Seekers focused on him rather than Dracket and Vex, he didn't care. After several minutes of cat and mouse through the junkyard, Martin found himself cornered. A wall of fused technology blocked his path forward, and the sounds of approaching Seekers came from behind. End of the line, he muttered to himself, turning to face his pursuers. The three Seekers emerged from the maze of junk, spreading out to block any escape route. Their faces, now visible in the strange twilight of the scraplands, were unsettlingly blank, human-like, but devoid of expression, with eyes that glowed with an internal light. Surrender the Ember Dragonet, the central Seeker commanded, its voice the same mechanical monotone Martin had heard at his apartment. Martin held up the force key, which was now glowing white-hot. Sorry, fresh out of Dragonets. Will this do instead? The Seekers advanced cautiously, their weapons trained on him. Human deception is inefficient. Our sensors detect the energy signature. Yeah, about that, Martin said, backing up until he felt the junk wall behind him. Funny thing about energy signatures, they can be misleading. The force key was now vibrating violently in his hand, the pain nearly unbearable. Martin had no idea what would happen if it exploded, but he suspected it wouldn't be pleasant for anyone in the vicinity. Just as the Seekers moved to apprehend him, a shadow passed overhead. Martin looked up to see Dracket, his wings suddenly fully extended, soaring above them. The Dragonet had grown, not dramatically, but noticeably, his scales now a brilliant azure that illuminated the junkyard. Now that, Martin said with a grin, is an Ember Dragonet. The Seekers turned as one, their sensors recalibrating. In that moment of confusion, Vex appeared behind them, moving with predatory grace. She dispatched the first Seeker with a device that seemed to short-circuit its systems, sending it crashing to the ground. The remaining two swiveled to confront this new threat, but Dracket chose that moment to dive, exhaling a jet of blue flame that engulfed one of the Seekers. The flame wasn't hot in a conventional sense. Instead, it seemed to distort the very air around the Seeker, causing its form to waver and then collapse in on itself. The last Seeker, recognizing the threat, aimed its weapon at Dracket. Martin didn't hesitate. He threw the force key with all his strength, striking the Seeker squarely in the back. The key, unstable and overloaded with energy, detonated on impact. The explosion sent Martin flying backward into the wall of junk, his world going momentarily dark. When he came to, seconds or minutes later, Vex was kneeling over him, her expression concerned. Dracket perched on her shoulder, watching Martin with those intelligent, otherworldly eyes. That, Vex said with a mixture of admiration and exasperation, was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed. Martin tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through his body. Did it work? Did you reach the gateway? We did not need to, Vex replied, helping him to his feet. It seemed Dracket had his own plans. As if on cue, the Dragonet leaped from Vex's shoulder to Martin's, nuzzling against his cheek. Martin noticed the wings, fully formed now, with delicate membranes stretched between spines of what looked like living crystal. He evolved. Martin asked, gently stroking Drakett's head. Accelerated growth, triggered by stress and the need to protect. Vex's skin patterns shifted to a contemplative blue. Most remarkable is that he returned for you. Ember dragons form profound bonds with their chosen guardians, but I've never seen one risk itself for a guardian it's known for less than a day. Martin looked at Drakett, who chirped softly and blinked those universe-containing eyes. So what happens now? Vex gestured toward the horizon, where the dual suns were setting in a spectacular display of alien colors. Now we continue to the gateway. The collectors will send more seekers once these fail to report back. We need to keep moving. And then, Vex said, her tone suggesting she was making a decision as she spoke, I think perhaps it is time for the collectors to learn why taking what belongs to a human is historically a poor decision. Martin looked down at his hands, which still tingled from contact with the Force key. You said something before about me resonating with the key. What did that mean? Vex's expression grew thoughtful. It means, Martin Reeves, veterinary technician from Earth, that you contain multitudes even you are unaware of. And it means that perhaps Drakett chose more wisely than even he knew. Drakett chirped agreement, his scales shifting to match the sunset hues. Martin stood straighter, feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. Well then, he said, scratching under Drakett's chin and eliciting a pleased rumble, I guess we better get moving. Apparently, we have some universes to save. Together, the unlikely trio set off toward the gateway, leaving behind the smoking remains of the Seekers, the first casualties in a conflict that would span dimensions, challenge empires, and remind the cosmos that humans, when properly motivated, have a habit of doing the impossible. And sometimes, they bring dragons along for the ride.